Thank you to our friends at the League of Women Voters of Clallam County who donated 10 copies of the book to the library collection. You can place a hold by visiting the library catalog or calling Knowles for assistance. Additional copies are available for purchase at your local independent bookseller. With that, I'd like to introduce my co-host for tonight's program, a good friend to the library and a member of the League of Women Voters, Paula Barnes.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Can everybody hear me? All right. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow League of Women Voters member, Bertha Cooper. Bertha has a nursing degree from the University of Washington, and she's had a long career in healthcare management and administration. In addition to being a passionate advocate for patient-centered services across the spectrum of healthcare, she's an excellent writer who loves to write. For readers of the Sequim Gazette, you're probably familiar with the biweekly column she's written for the paper for the past 8 years. In addition to the book we'll be discussing tonight, she's also the author of Old and on Hold, a very timely book filled with tips on how to stay mentally, emotionally, physically well when confined at home, say, for example, during a massive global pandemic. Bertha considers her crowning achievement, however, the fact that she successfully captured Paul, her husband of nearly 50 years. Please join me in welcoming Bertha Cooper.
Oh, Paula, thank you. I am quite overwhelmed with your interest. It was such a treat to watch so many people enter into this room, even if I could only see your name. I want to be sure everyone hears me. So Paula or Sarah, if I'm not coming across, please let me know. Give me a signal. Thank you for attending. I'm so gratified by your coming. I'm not surprised. There's a lot of interest in aging for women. We have a lot to learn. We know a lot. We have a lot of wisdom. And I can see that there are a variety of ages in the group that are here. So there's a great conversation to be had tonight. And I'm so grateful to be here. I know some of you, I recognize some of you. I don't know all of you, and I hope that now that you've seen me, if you see me at Costco or Safeway, and you can recognize me with a mask on, please make a point of saying hello to me. I would like that very, very much. I'm standing for this presentation mainly so I can refer to my notes. I need to have notes so I keep within the topic and I keep within the time limit that I have for the initial presentation, because we really want to open this up to a conversation with you with questions and comments. Let me start too by saying I'm deeply grateful to the North Olympic Library System and the League of Women Voters for the opportunity to have this conversation about my book, my exploration, my journey into becoming an old woman. I am an old woman. I am 77, not something I was looking forward to in my early 60s. The very first sentence I wrote for this book, and is the first sentence in the introduction to the book, is, I stood at the door to my old age, somewhat reluctant to enter. Since I was only partially committed to the inevitable, I took a cautious first look at this new territory and came up with more questions than answers. What should I wear? What must I plan? What must I pack? What do I leave behind? What does it matter? Well-meaning people, women, suggested I not use the word old in the book's title because no one would read it. I thought that too for the longest time. Finally, after rejecting about 24 titles of my own making, I realized, but that's why I'm writing. I'm writing about being old. Don't be afraid of your life, Bertha. When I was 66, I had an experience that stuck with me. A friend and I were attending a meeting. She mentioned she just turned 65. I was 65 at the time too. A person turned and said, "You two don't look 65. I got a light-heartedly answered, "This is what 65 looks like." The more I thought about it, the more I had to face the attitude about aging women in America. We don't know what old age looks like. Anything that doesn't match the vision of Haig or old crone is seen as an exception. That's not true in all cultures in America. Tribal elders are revered and honored in ceremonies and daily life. Not so much for women like me. I was in my mid-50s when I had my first being an invisible experience. It's all very annoying. And one of my motivations for writing Women Were Only Old Once was to change that attitude by discovering and telling people about the true beauty of old women. And it wasn't going to be looking like a 40 or a 50-year-old woman. Mostly I came to believe it was a ridiculous waste of energy and most importantly, time to live this part of my life in denial of who I was. But I needed to know more about aging and what I could do to sustain a quality of life and what would that quality look like? I wrote to that question. Aging doesn't start at 50, 55, 60, or 65. It starts at birth. Aging doesn't get a bad name until accompanied by wrinkles, arthritic bumps, and the certain knowledge that we have fewer years left to live than we have lived. Denial takes over, especially in a culture that markets anti-aging products, mostly to women. All my experience has shown me that aging into old age, like any other transition, is a natural process. I knew that my book, Women Were Only Old Once, had to inform and empower with understanding, choice, and control. In the time of my questioning, I learned how much women want this conversation. We're demonstrating it here today. From the moment I started talking about it, I discovered many other women shared the same curiosity, questions, concerns. Part of my motivation became to be a catalyst for the conversation and do it for all of us aging women. The book had to inform and empower. I'm going to assume that most of you are women. I have yet to see a man in the audience, which would be fine. I've had women tell me they've read some parts of the book with their husbands or partners. I will spend a few minutes talking about how I approached writing Women Were Only Old Once. Writing, it was not an unselfish endeavor. I started with a set of my own areas of inquiry and study, what I wanted and what I needed to know. Given my long career in healthcare as a nurse, an administrator, a consultant, I was well informed on the pathology of aging, not so much on natural aging. That's not what I saw. I started my journey by interviewing women between the ages of 55 and 75 with this same set of questions. The questions started with views of aging in our society and progressed through aging pluses, apprehensions, adjustments, and resolutions. I did 33 interviews. Their and my experiences are the beating heart of this book. I called upon experts to add substance and credibility to the book. Paul Cunningham, board-certified geriatrician. Claire Haycox, board-certified dermatologist. Carol Callahar, nurse practitioners, women healthcare specialists. Cheryl Bell, personal trainer, evolved now to yoga instructor. Pat Mortati, exercise physiologist and yoga instructor. I did a great deal of research, all of which is in the back of the book. And so anyone who's interested in delving more into what I found can go to those references. The themes I hope I successfully threaded through the book are several. One is that aging and becoming old is a continuation of the aging process. Another is our body cells are continuing to renew themselves, but not at the same rate, and in some cases, not at the same quality. And that means we need to make an adjustment to that, which might be physical, might be mental, it may be social, maybe in relationships. Another theme was entering old age through the young of old age, and I put that somewhere between 60 and 65, is like any other transitions. It's signaled by physical changes, emotional changes, and social changes. And those are all changes that need our attention. And I write about those. Another theme is that we have choice. Like that's a large theme threaded through, but we have choice. We can control our choices. I also wanted to be very sure that I made it clear that no one size fits all. It's not for me to tell someone else what to do. What it is for me to do is to help all of us make informed choices. At the point of information, then it's whatever works for that woman. Finally, it's never too late. Final thing, it's never too late. It's never too late to do something new, to try something new, to make an adjustment in what we're doing, to handle the ever-changing aging outcomes. A brief outline of my book, which many of you, if you've read it, you know it, but let me just briefly make some points with it. There's 4 parts. And the first part is looking backwards and looking forward. It's somewhat leading through a grieving process because there's a lot we let go of when we have to let go of as we get older. And then the importance of establishing a vision, something that we believe we should be when we are older or we will be. The second part is really focusing on what's going on in our bodies. What does it mean to us that our body isn't renewing itself as thoroughly and quickly as it has in the past? What can we impact? What can't we impact? What can we make no difference in? What choices do we have? Areas that I cover, I talk quite a bit about skin, the largest organ of our body. Talk quite a bit about endurance. Endurance was an area that there's near consensus of as you get older, you just don't have as much. And I talk a little bit about, well, why that is and what one can do to maintain what they have or maintain the potential of what they have. I spent a whole chapter on digestion and what changes are there, in part because there are a lot of symptoms that occur, but also because our nutritional needs change and we need to be aware of that yes, we should be sure we get enough protein in our diet. And then mental fitness, I'd call the chapter word finding and mental fitness, which was one of the areas that most concerned the women that I interviewed. And most of us have nightmare thoughts about what does it mean to lose control of your mind. So I try to make the distinction of what is normal and what is dimension. And it should reassure us that that's not going to be the fate of the vast majority of us. The third chapter is living as an older woman. What does it mean? I spend a lot of time talking on relationships. Relationships is what women do, and what's the impact of aging on relationships. And I include a chapter on sexuality in that. Finally, the last part of the book is what I call the soul of the book. It talks about our relevance, losses that matter, those losses that take a big chunk out of us, and we will never retrieve that. What does that mean? Talk about death, talk about spirituality, but more lead into and end with confirming that vision of becoming what we are and what we can be as a woman. Let me end my presentation here with a quote from my book. In our 60s, changes and losses take on different meaning. They touch us with the sense of no return and the certain knowledge that this time is different. It is then we must learn, if we haven't yet, the skill of letting go in order to move on. Our purpose, our health, and our bodies are changing. It becomes our life's job to keep up with the accelerating changes and losses. It may indeed involve more art than skill, but if ever there was a time to learn to let go, it is now. I look forward to your questions and comments. I'm going to turn this back to Sarah, Paula.
Thank you, Bertha. That was great. Everybody, if you want to go ahead and put any questions that you have in the chat, Paula and I have some questions for Bertha that we'll kick off with. I just wanted to mention, Bertha, that I really enjoyed parts of your book. I enjoyed the whole book, but parts of it were especially targeted to my situation. I'm probably not in maybe the target audience. I'm currently 38, but I am getting well now from having lived for a couple years with an undiagnosed illness. And as I'm trying to get back into exercise after essentially being on bed rest for a couple of years, my body's not bouncing back. And I just thought, maybe 38's too old to start running. And then I was reading your book and you said, reconditioning can happen at any age. But the longer you've been inactive, the longer it will take to restore your fitness. And I just really needed that last week when I couldn't run another lap. So I do think that this has value for all the young women that you might have in your life, just like you talk about in your book, kind of finding how you want to represent yourself, in how you dress and taking care of your skin and things like that. I feel like that's something that all of my age mates, we went through in our 30s. So it's going to be good to remind us that we're going to do it again. It's probably just a continual process for all women.
Well, Sarah, I'm delighted that you read the book.
Yes.
I'm delighted that you liked it. And I'm probably more delighted that you have recovered from whatever was going on with you. That sounds like it was a pretty big deal. Your point about, and you're not in the cohort, but I'd certainly be willing to, I would like to see younger women read this or something like it, because it's kind of a prep for the more you do, the younger you are, the more quality you have, the older you get. Let me respond to one thing you said about that you thought, well, maybe I'm too old, maybe at 38, which most of us on the screen are kind of thinking, well, gee, but maybe I'm too old. I saw that so much when I was working directly with patients or planning programs. I saw people literally give up trying. And that's part of the reason I wrote this, to try to say to someone, don't stop trying. Because if you stop trying, it does become that self-fulfilling prophecy, because your body won't work if you don't work it. And that's all systems. All systems need your support. So that's a great story, Sarah, and thank you so much for asking that question, or making those comments.
We did have one question from the audience. If you had interviewed women in their 90s, and I don't think you did. You stayed with kind of the younger old women. Do you want to talk about the like why you made the choices to interview who you did?
Well, partly because that was the age I was. I was in my mid-60s when I started, so I was starting the journey, and so my questions were, how do you get to 90? And I also interestingly, the oldest person I interviewed was 78, and that was someone that was referred by someone else who thought they should have the interview. And she turned out to be a most marvelous woman and a very resilient woman in her life. And I actually feature her in the last chapter as one of my heroines of aging. And she is about to turn 90 because of the way she lived her life and her involvement in her life and the things that she thought about. And when I did re-interview her again in her late 80s, and she was the same woman, and she had the same values and the same way of thinking and the same compassion. And so it was very reinforcing. Her story was very reinforcing. I do think that there's another book. I don't know if it'll be my book, because if it takes 10 years for me to get one published, I might be too old. That the decline, the aging decline continues, of course, and into 90s, there is more decline and more adjustment that takes place in that time. So I have no objection to interviewing someone 90, and I'll bet you someone 90 asked that question.
So Paula, do you want to ask your question? Whoops.
There we go. Yes, I just typed it into the chat, and I'll ask you, Bertha, live. Now that your book has been out for a while and you're probably getting some feedback and you've had some time to reflect on it, what do you plan when you produce the second edition? What would you like to add or change or emphasize in the second edition?
Well, Paula, that's a good question, because I have thought about that, and I've thought about the kinds of things that would be in the book today if I was writing the same book today, not even a second, but the same book. And one thing that I think becomes really important. I spend quite a bit of time talking about stress and managing stress. That's a challenge throughout our entire life. But as we get older, it's harder to manage stress. And we don't have the same capacity to handle so much stress at the same time. And it's important that we stop and we manage our stress, if that means letting go of a toxic relationship or getting rid of some clutter in the closet or whatever it is that's causing the stress, so we make room for unexpected stress. we're living a good example of unexpected, well, quite a few examples of unexpected stress right now. The pandemic, that's stressful. That's hard. We've had to adjust to that and adjust to that in a way that we would never considered. So I think I would amplify on that more than I did. And what I would bring in more is the importance of mindfulness. And I mean that quite literally in the sense that we have to pay more. The older we get, the more we have to pay attention to things. Are we neglect them because we've forgotten them? And it's not because we're losing our mind. It's just the way it is. If we have too much coming, we have to stop and sort that out. And a good word, which I know you're all familiar with, is mindfulness. And I'm not even meaning that in a spiritual way. I'm meaning that in a way that helps manage that stress, is to pay attention and say, this is important to be able to do that. So that would be one thing I would add. The other thing I've pondered, but I don't know exactly how I would do that, is the environment. You know, we're living through a particularly stressful environment, and whether it's climate change and changing or not changing, or doing something or not doing something, or politically, what do we do? What does this mean? This is really different. That I'm not exactly sure how I would handle it, to be very honest with you, but I would spend a lot of time thinking about that and devote time into writing about it and talking with people, and how does one manage that stress.
Thank you. Couple nice comments have come up in the chat. Congratulations on putting your book together on such a relevant topic. Susie says she's really enjoying the book and she feels like she finally has permission to live her life the way she wants. Last year, she started leasing a horse and feeding a lifelong passion that keeps her fit, healthy, happy, and sane. So thank you for giving us all the little kick that maybe some of us need. A couple lines up in the chat, there was a short discussion on elders versus elderly versus old. And you mentioned thinking about not putting old in the title. And to me, they do have different, elderly versus old versus aged, have different connotations. Do you find that they're used interchangeably, or tell us more about your thought process on choosing that title? We're all interested.
Yes, well, there have been a lot of attempts on old people's part to call ourselves something. Senior citizens, that's a favorite. Senior citizens. I finally settled on old because I couldn't quite figure out what was wrong with being old. And I am old, and I struggled with it because of that vision I talked about at the very beginning. We don't have a vision unless you're in a tribe. We don't have a vision of being old, what that is, in a positive way. And there's some really good reasons for that. One of it is because this is the last phase of life, and that's kind of scary. And I think as one enters into that and thinking about it, that's part of the resistance. I think that's pretty natural to feel that way and to do that. I would be interested, elderly, or that's a healthcare term that we use all the time in healthcare. The elderly, the programs for the elderly, that's a pretty common term. Maybe I should switch. How would that sound? Women, we are only elderly once. Doesn't have the same impact.
Doesn't.
Does it? No. But because the thrust of the title is like, hey, make the most of this, but do it understanding what's going on.
I wanted to ask you also, Bertha, you didn't talk in detail about the aging experience of different ethnic groups. And could you talk a little bit about why you chose not to?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot because as the book evolved, I thought, well, I should make this more inclusive. And I concluded that it wasn't my story to tell. I couldn't tell that story in the same way I could tell my story. It doesn't mean that it's not, any woman can read this book and they can get something out of this book, regardless of what their ethnic group is or what their race is. They could get something out of this book. But I felt if I interviewed and tried to pull in a narrative about an ethnic group that I had not lived and knew, that it would no longer be my voice, that it would be a report of somehow. So that was my thought process. But in the end, I think it's a weakness of the book. But it's how I went about it.
I think that own voices is something that we're seeing a lot, not appropriating the story of another group or another person. And so recognizing that story is out there and leaving space for a Native woman and African-American woman to tell that story. We just need to make sure that we support her the same way that we're supporting you so that we can get everybody's story.
Right.
Question from the chat is, did any of the interviewees address working on their bucket lists?
Gee, did anybody say on their working on? I didn't ask that question. Nothing readily comes to mind, and it may be because the interview just didn't go in that direction. So no, they certainly talked about things they didn't want to have happen. That was probably more like it. Like, I don't want a common thing. I don't want to be a burden on someone. Don't let me be a burden. Those kind of concerns. I'm sorry, no, I can't bring it to mind. If anyone here was interviewed and mentioned that, they could bring it up.
Could you talk a little bit about how the people you talk to deal with fears and, general fear and fear of, specific things? And it seems like as we get older, sort of like stress, you have to be able to manage fear. Did you get into that at all?
Yeah, I actually focused on that because I had a hypothesis in my head that there are different points in your life when you begin to develop more fears of dying or sense of mortality or as I just mentioned, disability, or won't be able to take care of myself. And part of the reason I picked that range 55 to 75 was I wanted to see was I on the right track about that? Because my own experience was I didn't really start dealing with these questions of mortality until I was in my late 50s, early 60s. And that actually proved to be somewhat true. I mean, it's not true for everybody. It was that there was a process of evolution of comfort with becoming older or being in this last phase of life as women grew older. Talking to a 60-year-old with some questions was different than talking to a 70-year-old, and certainly is different than talking to an 80-year-old. Because those questions kind of get resolved or yeah, and they may not end up in the same resolution for everyone, but it gets dealt with. It's like we have to do it. How they did it, I did ask the question of how, one of the questions was, how do you deal with loss? What do you do? Because it's so evident as we age that that's a skill, and I ended with that we have to learn. And women had a variety of responses that you would expect. Some said, well, I just go on, or some said, I look at it, I analyze it, I try to understand what happened. I talk to somebody. There were all the variety of managing that. One of the important things, and let me say that I heard from women, and I experience, I know it, is we rely on each other. Women do talk with other women quite a bit, and we learn from each other. That's been part of the value of the groups that I've come to talk about aging or talk about my book, which has not been many because it's too new. But by the way, it's something I would love to do. So if you have a group that would like to have a conversation about aging, I would love to participate if you wanted me. I'm not selling a service because I'm not charging, but it's just something I believe so strongly that it's so helpful to us to share our experiences and realize that we're not alone. So I think that was pretty common in that too. There was no magic way to do it. It's very individualized, I thought.
Okay. I happen to be one of the people that Bertha interviewed early on, and years went by and she was finishing her book and publishing. And it just so coalesced that there was a group of women before the book was published that got together. Probably there was 8 of us, 9 of us. And when I walked in the group, I knew a couple of the people that were there. A couple of people are here that were there. And it was an amazing discussion. We hadn't read the book, but Bertha presented, some provocative questions, and it really made an incredible difference to me. This small group of women sitting down and talking, who were in their late 60s, 70s, about aging and their experience of that. And sometimes there was tears, and sometimes there was just raucous laughter. And the one thing that I felt when Bertha finally got this book published was that that was the real learning experience for me. It was transitional. I really accepted much more of what was happening to me and what was going on, not just because Bertha was describing it, but because these other women were confirming it. And so I really encourage this. This is what I think that women need to do. And you don't need to just do it with friends, as it turns out. It can be totally enriching to do it with women, that you don't really know real well. And so I just wanted to add that, Bertha, to that idea you have of women sitting down and joining in and really being open and talking about this experience.
It was great fun too.
Yeah, it was
absolutely
great fun. It was.
One of the questions that has come up in the chat is there a group to join that's focused on socialization, sharing, having fun for people who are older? And I just checked online. It looks like the Senior Center hasn't been doing anything. You will find older people well represented at library programs. So remember to check out those ones that I mentioned at the front. But if you have suggestions for groups that are older adult focused, go ahead and put them in the chat. And then there was another question that I thought was particularly interesting. Bertha, could you very briefly summarize differences in aging between men and women?
Well, I didn't study men, although I'm married to a man who is 17 years older than I am. I like older people. And so he's been a laboratory of sorts for me in watching his aging. I've actually learned a lot from him. But I think this is certainly they have some of the same problems, although I will say that men do not have the same problem with their skin and wrinkling that women have. They have a thicker epidermis. It's totally unfair. But if you really look around and notice a man, I mean, in some parts of my face, I have more wrinkles than my husband. That's totally unfair. So there are that difference. I don't think, and this isn't news to anyone, that socially that men have the same issues that women have in society. I mean, we carry our issues throughout our life, and as women, and I think that they continue into old age, and there's definitely a distinction between the value of an older man and a value of an older woman, especially when it comes to relationships.
That's one of the other questions that's here in the chat is how many of your interviewees talked about that invisible feeling in social settings? And I think that that's something that older men don't experience to the same degree.
Common, very common. Good question, because I don't know if everyone probably understands what I mean by being invisible, but it was shocking to me the first time it happened. And unfortunately, it's happened since. And I was in my mid-50s. And I was waiting, I was my turn there was this young, kind of happy, vibrant clerk who was in Nordstrom's, who was finished her customer, took a look at me and passed me over and went to the next younger, vibrant, or went to the vibrant younger. And I realized then it had to do with me. It was an act. It had to do with my age. And I've experienced something like that since in other settings. I'll bet each one of you has some sort of story where that happened to you, where somehow you didn't, you got missed in this. The other thing that kind of grates me is people who are a waiter or server will come up and say, well, young ladies, what do you want today? Or what are you going to order? Or when my husband has gone to buy drinks at an open bar, I was with him and a woman said, oh, don't you think you should card that man? And it's so patronizing and I think disrespectful that when that happens. It happens a lot. Does everybody agree with me that happens a lot?
So
yes, I would say like 100% mention that, and knowing that difference occurred, and I think it has as much to do. It has to do with this not having a definition of goodness about old.
And that happens actually, to a number of people in different groups. It happens to large-bodied people. It happens to younger people. I have a 13-year-old and we have done a lot of like coaching him on, the life skills so he can stand in line and he can place his order, and people will actually push past him because he can't have legitimate business here, but everybody, no matter your body or your age or, whatever, unfortunately, I think a lot of people have had that experience.
You're right. You make a good point, Sarah. That's absolutely a good point, because that does happen. That certainly happens to young people.
Yeah, and I know it happens to, people who's, I guess anybody whose body is not ideal is kind of at risk for that. Whatever way your body is different from the front of a magazine, and there's a huge variety in ways that we can be different from that. It looks like in the chat there are a bunch of people who are really interested in a get-together for older participants. Unfortunately, we don't have anything planned, but I will mention that when the library is able to open, any of you would be able to reserve the meeting room for free, and then have a get together or any kind of meeting that you would promote. So if that has struck a chord with you, you really want to get this group together, you can plan on possibly using the library space at some time in the future.
When the pandemic relieves.
Yeah, when it's safe.
When we're all vaccinated.
That's right. Trust science, man.
Yeah, let me put a plug in too for the League of Women Voters. There are platforms out there, and I just saw someone on chat, Wendy Foster talked about Sweet Adelines. If you can sing, there's a group you can be with. I don't know how they do it over Zoom, but that's a group. The League of Women Voters, I went there searching for a platform about, I wanted to do something around healthcare reform. So that's where I landed. I hadn't been part of the League before. So it's really, there's quite a bit of socialization and apolitical environment that one can join. So that's one. So there are groups. There are groups. They're all modified now, though, because of the pandemic.
There's another good question from couple minutes ago from Kathy. So thanks for being patient, Kathy. She's wondering if you're experiencing an illness or onset of a symptom or condition, how can you tell between what's inevitable, like is it an inevitable sign of aging or something that you've developed, or is it something that you have control over, and how can you tell?
Well, you can't. When you have something, I emphasize throughout the book that it's important that you align with a medical professional, a healthcare provider, somebody who can help you know the difference. It's very important. It can be a mistake to say, well, that's because I'm getting old. So just if that comes to your head and that symptom is bothering you, you need to get it evaluated, and they should help you. Then on the other hand, if you go to a physician and you've got something that's bothering you, physical that's bothering you, a pain that won't go away, or something that you don't know what it is and you want to know, and your doctor just says to you, or your healthcare provider says to you, well, that's just aging. Well, I say in my book, that's just the time to get another healthcare provider. Because even if it was aging, that provider needs to tell you, why is it causing that symptom? To give you some explanation of what's happening to you. We need all the information we can get. And I'm afraid that doesn't always come from a healthcare provider, that they can dismiss aging or symptoms as aging. So we have to be our own advocate for our health.
You have a couple stories in the book of a family member or a person who had to get second opinions and really track down, and not take no for an answer, and not say, there's something wrong with me, that's just how I'm going to live. That's right. And I think a lot of people have also experienced that. I experienced that with my illness, where a doctor said, that's just how you are.
Oh dear.
I think, you point out in your book that we have to listen to our bodies and know, this doesn't seem right, or this hurts out of proportion to what's going on.
Yeah, we are stewards of our body. We are the only steward of our body. There isn't anyone else who's going to take responsibility for us. So that's why the choices are ours, and that's why we have to advocate for it. If we have trouble advocating, and some people do, they have a mystique about healthcare providers and think, well, they probably know. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. So you can bring somebody with you, a trusted person with you.
That's a good idea, because especially if you're tired or not feeling well, it's hard to advocate for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
to have that fight again.
Are intimidated in some way, or have a healthcare provider who is intimidating.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. Did anybody else have any additional questions that they wanted to submit? Annette says, yes, we have to be responsible for our own pathway and can't expect others to take the lead. And that is kind of, you know, when you're in that position and you have to advocate for yourself to a medical professional, it's kind of sad. Like, at least that was my experience. Like, shouldn't somebody else, isn't it your job to care about me? Why do I have to convince you that this is an important thing to look at? But it, you know, it is. And I think maybe if we can help people who are well kind of get that ready in their mind so that they don't have to learn it when they're sick.
I think that's right. To have that confidence.
All right. Were there any other questions for Bertha?
May I say, I am just very pleased, very happy with this event. And again, if any of you, you know, have a small group or a group that you would just like to have that discussion with, you can contact me through the league or probably through the library too now. Sarah, is that right?
I'm very happy to
Pass on
on.
message to me. I'm happy to do that. I think it's important for all of us. So thank you very much. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for reading my book.
I'll put my contact info in the chat. So if anybody ever has a question, they can help pass it. I can help pass it on there.
And just another reminder that the library does have several copies of the book, although there are a bunch of holds waiting. If you're patient, you can get on the list and get a copy through the library.
Yep, holds aren't too bad yet. And if we get enough, we'll buy more copies as we do for everything.
Yeah, the book's not on Kindle yet. The publisher is the one who does that, and it's in line to put on Kindle, but I don't know when that's going to happen.
Susie wants to know if we can email out a link to the video when it's available. I would say, because there were so many people here tonight, I don't want to spam everybody. If you just want to send me an email that you're interested in it, then I'll put you on the list. And as soon as we can manage to get it up, I will email you back. So that way a bunch of people don't get emails they don't want, if that's okay. All right. Thank you, Bertha. Everybody's expressing their thank you for writing the book and for being here.
Reading that is it's just wonderful to read. Who is the publisher? The publisher is MSI Press, and they are an independent publisher. It took me a long time to find a publisher, and it was very frustrating to try to find an agent or I don't know what they're called, the big deal publishers. The reason I couldn't is because I had no platform. I couldn't just present my name and 5,000 people would buy my book. And that was pretty much what you had to be. It's a very different publishing world now. So I was extremely gratified, just gratified when this person, it was a year ago on my husband's birthday that this publisher said, yeah, we'll do it. This is good, because it's a lot. Publishing, I've learned it's a lot. So I was very lucky.
I was just gonna look up one other thing here. Whoops.
They are, while you're looking, they are a good read. If you're a writer, and I haven't seen them do much fiction. Go on their website, you might find that you could find a home for your writing.
I don't actually see copies of your other book about aging in place, which is obviously an oversight on our part. We will get some copies of both of your books.
It's a small book, and it's called Old and on Hold: Aging in Place During a Pandemic.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here, for making time, and for your great questions. Paula, did you have anything for wrapping up? I may have lost Paula. That is okay. Keep writing, Bertha. We really appreciated your time tonight, and we'd love to see more from you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Yes. Bye-bye.